Before you read, a small honesty. I am not a man who tells stories well. I keep a tally book, not a journal. Cattle counted, nails counted, the days a man works for me and the days he don't. Numbers don't lie and they don't ask you to feel anything. So when I tell you that the winter of that year broke something open in me that no number could measure, understand that I am reaching past the edge of what I know how to say. There was a woman. There were 2 children. And there was a man I worked beside for 11 years whom I thought I understood completely, until one cold morning showed me I had never understood him at all. If you have ever stood at the line between what is easy and what is right, and felt the wind on both sides of it, then this story is already partly yours. Stay with me. I will tell it the only way I know how, which is plain and a little broken and true. I counted 41 steps from the bunkhouse to the north fence that morning, and I remember the number because counting was the only thing keeping my hands from shaking. It was the kind of cold that has teeth. Not the gentle ache of a hard November, but the deep January cold that comes down off the high country like something with a grudge, that turns the ground to iron and the air to glass. The snow had stopped sometime in the dark, and the world it left behind was white and flat and silent in a way that felt almost rude, like the land had decided to forget we lived on it. I'd gone out to check the south water trough. It froze most mornings, and a man had to go bust the ice or the cattle wouldn't drink, and I'd taken the long way around past the north line because Amos liked me to eyeball the fence after a storm. That was the only reason I saw them at all. 41 steps and a turn of the head. If I'd gone the short way, I'd have missed them, and everything that came after would have been some other man's story, or no story at all. There was a shape against the bottom rail of the fence. At first I took it for a drift. The snow does that, piles itself into the shape of things that aren't there, fools you into seeing a steer or a man or a wagon where there's nothing but cold, dumb weather. But this drift had a color to it that snow doesn't have. A brown. A blanket brown frosted white at the edges where the wind had laid its hand. And then the drift moved just barely, just a shudder, and I understood with a lurch in my gut that I was looking at a person. I want to tell you I ran. The honest thing is that I stood there a full breath, maybe 2, frozen by something worse than the cold. Because in those days, a shape at the edge of an Apache country ranch could mean any number of things, and not all of them were a person needing help. I was an old man even then, 50-some, and I had learned to be afraid of the things the desert leaves at your fence line. My hand went to where a gun would have been if I'd thought to wear one. Then the shape made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was thinner than a word, the kind of sound a body makes when it has spent everything it has and is asking, without any hope of an answer, for just a little more. And underneath it, smaller, was a second sound. A child. I ran then, 41 steps back to the house, and I didn't count a one of them. Amos Hale was at the stove when I came through the door without knocking, which I never did, and he turned with the coffee pot still in his hand, and read my face the way he read weather and cattle and men, all at once and without a wasted second. North fence, I got out. A woman, Apache, I think, and a young one, maybe more. They're freezin', Amos, they're nearly gone. I have known a lot of men in my life who would have asked questions first, whose first thought, hearing Apache on their own land in that country in those years, would have been a calculation of risk. Who's out there? How many? Whether it was a trap, whether helping was the same as choosing a side in a thing that had been killing people on both sides for longer than either of us had been alive. Amos Hale set the coffee pot down on the stove, not careful, just down, and said, "Get the sled and the bearskin. I'll bring the lantern and the brandy." That was all. That was the whole of his deliberation. I have thought about that moment more times than I can count, and I have never decided whether what he did was courage or whether it was something simpler and rarer, which is that some men do not seem to have the part inside them that pauses to weigh a suffering body against their own safety. The pause was just gone from him. Where I had it, he had nothing, and into that nothing he poured everything else. We went out together into the white. There were 3 of them. The woman, and a boy who I'd guess was 10 by his height and older than that by his eyes, and a girl so small that at first I thought the boy was carrying a bundle and not a sister. The woman had them inside her blanket with her, one under each arm, her own body curled around them like a question mark, like a wall, like the last argument she had left to make against the cold. She had given them everything. That was plain even to a man who counts nails for a living. Her lips were the wrong color. The boy's eyes were open and watching us, and full of a hate so old and so tired it could not even raise itself to be a threat. The girl was asleep, or I prayed she was asleep. Amos knelt in the snow in front of them and held up his open hands. Empty hands. He did not speak any Apache that I knew of, and they showed no sign of English. And so for a long moment the four of them just looked at each other across a foot of frozen ground, and the only language any of them had was the oldest one, which is the body, which is I am not going to hurt you, which is please, which is I have nothing left. The woman's eyes moved from Amos's face to his hands, to mine to the sled to the bearskin we'd brought, and I watched her do a piece of arithmetic in that frozen second that I will never forget as long as I live. She was deciding whether to trust us, and she had every reason in the world not to. Men who looked like us had taken everything from people who looked like her. Her husband, I would learn later, among them, and the husband's brothers, and the place she had been born, and the right to walk on the ground she was now dying on. Every reason in the world to spit at us, to claw, to choose the cold over the kindness of the men who'd made the cold deadly. And she looked at her children. And she let go of them. She unfolded her arms, and it cost her, I could see it cost her, a lifetime of holding on poured out in the act of letting go, and she pushed the boy toward Amos, first the boy, the strong one, the one who might run, and only after the boy was safe in the bearskin did she allow her own body to fall sideways into the snow. That is the moment I want you to hold, not the rescue, not the warm house that came after, that moment. A mother who had been given 100 reasons to hate us, choosing in the last spendable second of her strength to gamble the only thing she had left in the world on the bare chance that two strange men in a cruel country might be kind. I have been told my whole life that the great virtue of the human animal is courage. After that morning I have come to believe it is something quieter and more terrible than courage. It is the willingness to trust again after trust has only ever cost you. I do not have a word for it. I only have the picture of her arms opening. We got them in the house. I will spare you the worst of it, the long hour of rubbing life back into limbs that didn't want it, the way the girl woke screaming when the warm came back into her feet, because the warm hurt worse than the cold had, the boy who would not be parted from the door and stood guard at it with a fireplace poker in his small fist, until exhaustion folded him down onto the floorboards like a dropped coat. Amos let him keep the poker, didn't try to take it. Just laid a folded blanket near the door where the boy had chosen to stand, so that, when the child finally fell, he'd fall on something soft. The woman came back slowest. There was a stretch where I thought we'd lost her, where her breath got so shallow and so far apart that Amos and I stopped talking and just listened, counting the seconds between, and I caught myself counting them out loud, the old habit, the only prayer I had, 1, 2, 3, 4, and Amos put his hand on my shoulder, not to stop me, I think, but to count along. She came back. Sometime past noon her eyes opened and found the room and found her children sleeping warm by the fire and found, last, the two of us sitting across from her with our hats in our hands like fools at a funeral, and she did not thank us. I want to be clear about that, because the cheap version of this story would have her weep and thank us. And it would be a lie. She looked at us with a face I could not read at all, a face that had walls inside walls, and she pulled her children's sleeping bodies a little closer and she watched us. That was all. She had decided to live. She had not yet decided to trust us with the living. That seemed fair to me. It still does. Now I have to tell you the part that I have never been easy about. By the third day, word gets around. It always does in country like that, on wind I never could trace. A rider came up the road on the third afternoon, a man named Coombs who ran cattle to the east of us, and who had buried a son in the Troubles 2 summers back and had not put down the hatred of it, would never put it down, carried it the way some men carry an old wound that aches before rain. He sat his horse in our yard, and he had 2 other men with him, and he said he'd heard Amos Hale was harboring Apache. I was at the barn, I heard it all. They're half-dead women and children, Coombs, Amos said. He'd come out onto the porch without a coat. A mother and 2 young ones, found 'em frozen at my fence. I know what they are, Coombs said. I know exactly what they are. You give 'em a meal and you point 'em back the way they came. Hale, that's the Christian thing, nobody'd fault you that. But you keep 'em on this land, and you're tellin' every man in this valley which side of the ground you stand on. He leaned down over his saddle horn. There's people who'd remember that. There's people who'd make you remember it. And here is the morally heavy thing, the thing I promised you. Because what Coombs was offering was a door. A clean, easy, blameless door. Feed them and send them off. No one would have called it cruel. The cold had broken. They'd survived. A man could put them on the road with a sack of cornmeal and a clear conscience and never have to choose anything at all. I confess to you now, 14 years gone, that some part of me wanted Amos to take that door. I had a stake in this place. I was an old man with no other place to be, and Coombs was not making an idle threat, and I knew it. And a fence and a roof and 11 years of work stood behind me when I held my breath on that porch and waited to hear what Amos Hale would say. Amos was quiet a long moment. I saw his jaw work. I want you to know he was not a man without fear. That's the cheap version too, the fearless hero, and it's a lie like the other one. He was afraid. I knew his face, and it was afraid. The pause that had been missing on the first morning, the pause between a suffering body and his own safety. It was here now on the porch, because now it wasn't a body in the snow asking him for warmth. It was his whole life asking him to be reasonable. You buried a boy, Amos said finally, quiet. I'm sorry for it. I mean that, Coombs. I knew him a little. He was a good hand. Don't, Coombs said. There's a boy in my house right now, Amos went on like he hadn't heard. Sleeps with a poker in his hand 'cause he watched men do to his father what was done to your son. And I figure both those boys' daddies thought they were on the right side of the ground. He set his hand on the porch rail. I'm too old to know which side that is any more, Coombs. I just know there's children froze near to death in my front room, and I'm not putting them back out in it. You do what you have to do. So will I. Coombs looked at him for a long time. Then he straightened in the saddle and turned his horse, and the 3 of them rode out. And they did not say goodbye, and the silence they left in the yard was worse than any words. I came out of the barn. Amos was still on the porch, both hands on the rail now, and I saw that they were shaking, and not from the cold, because the cold had broken. I stood next to him. I did not know what to say, so I said the only true thing I had. That was the right answer, I told him, and it might have been a stupid one, both at once. He laughed, a short, broken-off thing, more breath than laugh. Yeah, he said, usually is. That night the woman came to the kitchen. The children were asleep. She came on bare feet, silent, the way her people moved, and she stood in the doorway in the firelight, and Amos and I, both startled because we hadn't heard her, would never have heard her. She had wrapped herself in one of the blankets, and she looked stronger, 3 days of warmth and food putting some of the color back, and she looked at Amos a long time the way she had looked at him in the snow, doing her arithmetic. Then she spoke. The first words any of them had spoken to us. Her English was broken, but it was there, hidden all that time, a card she'd kept face down until she was sure of the table. The man on the horse, she said. Today he wants us gone. Amos didn't lie to her, I'll give him that, he could have. Yes, he said. She nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something she'd always known about the world. And then she said the thing that I have carried with me, the thing that turned this from a story about 3 people we saved into a story about 3 people who saved something in us that I hadn't even known was dying. My husband, she said, told me before he died there are no good men left in this country. She looked at the fire, not at us. He was a wise man, he was right about everything. A pause. The fire popped. He was wrong about this. And she turned and went back to her sleeping children, and left the two of us sitting in a kitchen that did not feel the same as it had that morning, in a house that did not feel the same, on a piece of ground that I understood all at once. We had just agreed to defend, though against what exactly, we did not yet know. That was the first part of it. The cold had brought them. The warm had kept them. But it was the spring that was coming for us and what it brought that I have the hardest time telling. I will tell you, though. I promised her, in a manner of speaking, that I would. She never did tell us her name those first weeks. She had her reasons. By the time she did, it had stopped mattering what we called her. She had become, simply, ours to keep and we hers. But I am getting ahead of the count. Let me go back to the spring. A word before I go on. People who hear the first part of this always want the second part to be the easy one. The cold is over, they figure. The hard thing is done. The good men have made their choice, and now comes the reward, the slow thaw, the children laughing, the woman's walls coming down brick by brick like in a song. I understand wanting that. I wanted it too. But I have learned that the hardest part of doing a kind thing is rarely the doing. It's the after. It's the long flat country of days that comes once the drama is spent, when you have to keep on choosing the kind thing over and over with nobody watching and no blizzard to make it feel like courage. It's the neighbors. It's the slow poison of being talked about. It's the way a small, mean world will work on a good man, patient as water on stone, until he wonders if he was a fool. That's the second part. It nearly broke us worse than the cold ever did. Stay with me a little longer. We're not at the worst of it yet, but we're getting there. The snow went off the low ground in March, all at once, the way it does 3 warm days and a wind out of the south, and suddenly the world was mud and noise and the smell of things growing that had been dead a week before. I counted 17 new calves that spring, which was a good number, and I remember being out among them in the wet dawn light feeling almost happy, and then remembering that I had not felt almost happy in a long time, and wondering, the way you do, what had changed. It was the boy. His name was Kla. The woman gave us the children's names before she gave us her own, another piece of her arithmetic, I think, trusting us with the smaller things first. Kla, the boy, and the little girl was Sada, though Sada could not say her own name yet without it coming out Tada, and so Tada she became to all of us, even to Kla, who was the only one with the right to tease her for it and did, mercilessly, the way an older brother will. Kla had stopped sleeping at the door. I don't know exactly when it happened. There was no morning where he announced it, but sometime in February I'd come down before light to start the stove and the folded blanket by the door was empty, and I found the boy asleep on the hearth instead, closer to the fire, closer to the warm middle of the house, his poker. He still kept the poker laid down beside him instead of clutched in his fist. A small thing. I am a man who notices small things. It is the one use of a life spent counting. A boy who had decided the door no longer needed guarding, had decided something much larger than that, and had decided it without telling anyone. Maybe without knowing it himself. By March he was shadowing me at the calving. He didn't ask to. He just appeared at my elbow one morning, watching, and when I knelt to help a heifer that was having a hard time of it he knelt too, and when I showed him how to find the calf's forelegs and ease them, he watched my hands with a fierce concentration, and the next hard birth he did it himself before I'd finished telling him how. He had good hands, quick and gentle and unafraid of the blood and the mess of a thing being born. Better hands than mine at his age. I told him so, in the few words and many gestures we'd built between us, and he looked at me like he didn't believe me and was storing it away anyhow. Amos saw it, of course he saw it. Amos saw everything. "You're teaching him," he said to me one evening, not a question. "He's teaching himself," I said. "I'm just standing in the way of him doing it wrong." Amos smiled at that, the small private smile he had, and went back to mending the bridle in his lap, and didn't say the thing I could see him not saying, which was, "What happens to that boy when this is over?" Because we both knew it would be over. The woman would heal, and the weather would hold, and one day she would have somewhere to go, her own people or what was left of them, and she would take her children and go, because that was the natural shape of the thing, the shape we told ourselves it had. We'd taken in 3 people who needed taking in. We had not adopted a family. There is a difference, and we both knew the difference, and we were both, I think, already starting to forget it. Her name was Desba. She told us in April, on a night I'll come back to. But before that night, there was the matter of the valley. I told you Coombs rode off that first winter day with a silence worse than words. That silence didn't stay in our yard. It traveled. By the time the roads dried, every soul in 40 miles knew that Amos Hale had taken in an Apache widow and her 2 and meant to keep them. And the valley did with that knowledge exactly what small, frightened places always do with a thing they don't understand. It made the thing into a story, and the story into a verdict, and the verdict went against us. It started small. It always starts small. The freight man who'd hauled our supplies for 9 years began to be unavailable on the days we needed him, then began to be unavailable altogether. The mercantile in town, where I'd traded for the better part of a decade, took to being out of things, out of coffee, out of nails, out of the particular plug of tobacco Amos favored, out of them only when I came, I noticed, because I'd see them on the shelf behind the counter plain as day. Men I'd shared a fire and a bottle with stopped meeting my eye on the street. A preacher I won't name said a thing from his pulpit about the wages of consorting with savages that got back to us through 3 mouths and lost nothing in the telling. And here is where I have to tell you about Amos and the thing I called, in the first part, stubbornness, though that's too small a word for it. The way courage was too small a word for the woman's arms opening. A reasonable man, faced with a whole valley turning its back, bends a little, finds a compromise, sends the family to a cabin out of sight, maybe, keeps them but quiets it, lets the talk die down, lets the world save its own face so it can go back to selling him coffee. There's no shame in that. It might even be the wise thing. Amos did the opposite. Amos got spiteful. When the mercantile was out of coffee, Amos drove the family, all of them, Desba and Claw and little Tata in the wagon bed, clear into town on a Saturday when the street was full, and walked them down the boardwalk slow as you please, and tipped his hat to every man who wouldn't look at him, and bought what he needed at the mercantile by the simple method of standing at the counter and not leaving until he was sold to, while the whole town pretended not to watch and watched. He bought Tata a peppermint stick. He let her pick it. He paid for it in front of God and everybody, and he made the storekeeper put it in the child's hand directly. And the child, who had been terrified, who had clung to her mother's skirt the whole length of that hostile street, the child looked up at the storekeeper and said thank you in the English her mother had taught her in the long winter nights, and I watched something move across that storekeeper's face that he did not want to feel and could not help feeling. That was Amos's whole strategy, if you can call spite a strategy. He had decided that the valley's problem was that it had never once had to look these people in the face as people, and so he was going to make it look, over and over on every Saturday, until looking became a habit and the habit wore the hate thin. It was the most stubborn, foolhardy, dangerous thing I ever saw a man do. It put us all at risk. Coombs's threat had not gone anywhere, was sitting out there to the east aging like a hard cheese, and it worked about as often as it failed, and Amos did not care which, because he had stopped, I think, weighing things. The pause was gone again, the way it had been gone at the fence. He had simply decided what kind of man he was going to be, and the deciding had freed him from the arithmetic the rest of us were always doing. I did the arithmetic for both of us. Somebody had to. The night Desba told us her name was the night the lambing shed burned. We didn't keep sheep. That was the Prout place, 2 miles south, the Prouts being the only other family in the valley who hadn't turned cold on us, on account of old Prout being too deaf to hear the gossip and too ornery to have cared if he had. Their shed went up around midnight, and we saw the glow from our porch, and Amos had the horses saddled before I'd got my boots on, because that's the kind of man he was, and we rode for it through the dark. It was bad. The shed was gone before we got there, but the wind was carrying sparks toward the Prout house and the barn beyond it, and the Prouts were two old people and a hired boy with a single bucket between them and a dry spring night that wanted to burn the whole south end of the valley to the ground. We threw ourselves into it. I won't pretend it was orderly. It was a long, ugly hour of smoke and heat and old men coughing, of a bucket line that was mostly just Amos and me, and the Prout boy running back and forth from the creek like our lives depended on it, which I suppose they did. And then there were more hands. I looked up from the creek bank with a full bucket, and there were riders coming in out of the dark, 4, 5, 6 of them, and my heart went cold because in that country riders at midnight near a fire meant trouble more often than help. But they came off their horses and into the bucket line without a word, and I knew their faces. Men who'd stopped meeting my eye on the street. Men who'd let me stand at the counter unserved. They had seen the glow same as we had, and whatever else they believed about Amos Hale and his Apache, they were not the kind of men who could watch a neighbor's place burn and stay home. There's a thing that lives underneath the meanness in people, in most people, and a fire in the night will pull it up out of them whether they want it pulled or not. We saved the house. We saved the barn. We lost the shed and a dozen ewes and a good deal of skin off everybody's hands, but we saved the things that mattered, and when the sun came up the south end of the valley was still standing, smoke-stained and exhausted, and a dozen men who had not spoken to each other in months were sitting in the trampled mud too tired to remember why. And Desba was there. She had come, I hadn't known it, hadn't seen her in the dark and the chaos. She had come on foot the 2 miles behind us, leaving the children sleeping with a neighbor woman I'd have sworn wouldn't take them. And she had worked the bucket line the whole hour beside men who'd called her things I won't write down, and not one of them had turned her away from the water. Because when a thing is burning, you do not ask the hands beside you who they are, you just pass the bucket. I found her at dawn sitting on the creek bank with her hands raw and her face black with smoke, and she was looking at the Prout house still standing, and she was crying, which I had never once seen her do, not in the cold, not in the worst of the healing, not on the hostile boardwalk. Crying quiet, the way she did everything. I sat down next to her. I didn't say anything. I'm not good at the saying. At home, she said after a while, before when there was a fire everyone came. Everyone. You did not ask. You did not count who was your friend. She wiped her face with the back of a ruined hand. I had forgotten people could be like this. I told myself I had dreamed it, that it was a story I made for the children, that there had ever been a place where people came when you were burning. She looked at me. Tonight they came. They came for the Prouts, I said, because I am a man who tells the truth even when a kinder lie is right there. Not for you, not yet. I know, she said, and then, with the ghost of something that on another face would have been a smile, but they passed me the bucket. That was the night she told us her name. We rode home in the gray morning, the 3 of us, too tired to talk, and at the door she stopped and said, Desba, my name is Desba, like she was handing us something she'd been carrying a long way. You should know it, if you are going to be in this with us. And she went inside to her children, and Amos and I stood in the yard in the dawn, filthy and burned and not at all sure what we were in, only that we were in it, all the way in, past the place where a man could pretend he'd just done a kindness for a stranger. I wish I could tell you the fire fixed the valley. It didn't. That's the cheap version again. By the next Saturday the mercantile was out of coffee again, and the preacher had found new texts, and the men who'd passed Desba the bucket at midnight would not pass her the time of day in daylight, because the dark gives people permission to be better than they'll let themselves be in the light. People are like that. I've stopped being surprised by it. But something had shifted, all the same, down underneath where the eye can't see it but the count can feel it. A crack in the stone. A few men in the valley now had stood in a bucket line beside an Apache woman and seen her work as hard as any of them to save a white family's home, and a thing like that does not unhappen. It sits in a man. It waits. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, sitting exhausted and almost hopeful in that smoke-gray dawn, was that Coombs had been at the fire too. I'd seen him there. I'd thought nothing of it. Half the valley was there. I didn't know yet that he had watched Desba work that bucket line all night, the woman whose people he blamed for his dead son, and that something had happened in him watching her that was not the thing that happened in the others. Not the thaw. The opposite of the thaw. Some men, you show them a reason to hate less, and it only frightens them. And a frightened hatred is the most dangerous kind there is, because it has felt the ground move under it, and it will do anything, to make the ground hold still again. I'll tell you what Coombs did. But not yet. Let me have this one morning first, the way we had it then, tired and burned and almost happy, not knowing. We earned that morning. Let me keep it a little longer before I tell you what the summer took. She slept the whole way home in the wagon bed with her children, the three of them tangled together, and Amos drove slow over the ruts so as not to wake them, slower than he needed to, and I understood then that he was no more ready than I was for any of it to end. I have noticed, telling this story over the years, that people lean in close at this part. They've been promised a hard ending. I promised it myself, and a piece of them wants the hardness, wants the tears, the way people slow down to look at a wreck on the road. I don't blame them. I've done it. But I want to ask one thing of you before we get there, because I think it's the only way to hear this part right. Don't brace for it. Don't get ready to be sad, because the ending of this is not the kind that hits you all at once like a fall. It's the kind that you don't feel until later, until a particular slant of light or a smell or a child's voice in a crowd you can't see the source of, and then it takes you down at the knees when you least expect it, 14 years on, an old man at a fence. That's the truth of the good ones, the losses that were also gifts. They don't announce themselves. They just wait for you. So don't brace. Just walk with me to the end of it the way we walked it then, not knowing, hopping, almost happy. That's the only honest way in. By July, I had stopped doing the arithmetic. I want you to understand what that meant coming from me. I had counted my whole life, cattle and nails and the seconds between a dying woman's breaths. I counted because the world was a frightening place and the numbers held still when nothing else would. But somewhere in that long green summer, I caught myself standing in the yard at dusk watching Cla teach Tata to throw a loop. She was hopeless at it. She got the rope around her own ankles every time and shrieked with laughter every time. And Cla was patient with her the way he was patient with the calves. And Desba was on the porch with Amos shelling peas into a bowl, the two of them not talking, just sitting in that easy quiet that married people have, though they weren't married. Weren't anything anyone had a word for, and I realized I wasn't counting the cattle in the near pasture or the days till winter or the cost of any of it. I was just standing there in the warm, letting it be what it was. That frightened me more than Coombs ever had, because a man who has stopped counting has stopped getting ready to lose things, and I knew the way you know whether, that we had not earned the right to stop. They had become a family. I'll just say it plain, since I spent 2 whole parts of this dancing around it. The 4 of them and me the 5th, the old uncle in the bunkhouse. Cla called Amos by his name, but had taken to standing close to him the way a son does, shoulder near the father's shoulder, soaking something up. Tata had decided I belonged to her personally, and would climb me like a fence post and demand I count things for her. She loved the counting, loved making me do it. Cobb, how many chickens, Cobb, how many stars, and I would count for her until she fell asleep against my chest. And an old man who had used numbers his whole life as a wall against feeling found himself using them at last for the opposite thing. Desba and Amos I will not try to describe, because some things a decent man doesn't put into words, but I will tell you the house had a center it hadn't had before, and we all of us turned toward it the way stock turns toward water. And Coombs was dying of it, not literally, but the way the valley was softening was killing something in him that he needed alive. Here is the thing about a man like Coombs that I came to understand too late. He was not, at bottom, a hateful man. That's the part nobody wants to hear, because it's easier if the Coombses of the world are just bad. He was a grieving man who had built his whole self around the shape of his grief, who had made his dead son's memory into a fortress. And the walls of that fortress were the simple iron belief that the people who'd killed his boy were not people at all but something else, something you could hate clean and easy with no part of you left over to ache. And here was Desba working a bucket line to save a neighbor's house. Here was Kla easing a calf into the world with hands gentler than any white boy's in the valley. Here was little Tata saying thank you on a hostile boardwalk in careful borrowed English. Every one of those things was a stone pulled out of Coombs's fortress wall, and he could feel the wall coming down, and behind the wall was not relief. Behind the wall was the whole raw, unwalled grief he'd been hiding from for 2 years, the simple, unbearable fact of a boy he loved being dead and nobody to hate clean for it. A man will burn down the world before he'll feel that. I know it now. I've felt the edge of it myself, 14 years on. So Coombs got busy. He spent that summer riding the valley talking, the way a frightened man talks, not threats, not at first just worry, just concern, just what kind of valley do we want to be, just it starts with one ranch and where does it end? He was good at it. Grief makes some men eloquent. By August he'd gathered a knot of the fearful around him and given their fear a shape and a direction, and the direction was our north fence. The same fence, I thought when I heard, the same fence where it all began. They were going to come and put the family off the land, by force if it came to it. A committee, Coombs called it, which is the word frightened men use when they want to do an ugly thing in a crowd so no single one of them has to own it. We heard it was coming 3 days out. The Prout boy rode up to tell us, old Prout sending his hired boy at risk to himself, because old Prout remembered who'd come for his house at midnight. 3 days. That was when Desba made her decision, and it was not the one any of us expected, and it was the heaviest thing in this whole heavy story, heavier than the cold, heavier than the fire. She decided to leave. Not because of Coombs. That's what I thought at first, and I was wrong, and she set me right with a patience I didn't deserve. She sat us all down, Amos, me, the children sent out to the yard, and she said it plain in the English that had grown sure over the long months. If we go because of him, she said, then he has won and I will not give him that, so that is not why we go. She folded her hands. We go because I have watched what this costs you, Amos, and I have been letting myself not see it because I did not want to. You cannot buy coffee in your own town. Men you have known your whole life will not look at you. And now they will come with guns to your fence, and you will stand in front of them because that is who you are, and one day, not this day maybe, but one day someone will be frightened enough to pull a trigger and it will be you, or it will be Cobb, or it will be one of my children, and I will have done that to you. I will have brought that to your door because you were kind to me one cold morning. Her voice did not break. I want that on the record. It did not break, though mine is breaking now to write it. I would rather take my children north to look for what is left of their father's people, and not know if we find them, than stay here and watch your goodness get you killed. I have already buried one good man this country made a target of. I will not bury another. Amos argued. Of course he argued. He said the valley was turning, that they only had to hold on, that the bucket line men were proof it was working. He said, and his voice did break, where hers had not, that he didn't want to buy his safety with their leaving, that it wasn't safety at all if it cost him them. And Desba looked at him with everything she had, all the walls down at last, and said the thing that ended it. You did not change this country, Amos. One man cannot. The country is too big and too cruel and too old. She reached over and put her raw brown hand on his. But you changed us. My husband told me before he died that there were no good men left in this country, and he was wise, and he was right about everything, and he was wrong about you. I came here believing the world had no kindness in it for people like mine. I will leave believing differently, and I will raise my children to believe differently, and Kla will be a man who knows, because he lived it, that a stranger can open his arms instead of his hand. That is not nothing. That is everything. You did not change the country. You changed everything that matters. She stood. Let me take that gift and go before this country takes it back. They left at dawn 2 days later, ahead of the committee, in a wagon Amos loaded with everything we could spare, and a good deal we couldn't. I won't draw out the goodbyes. Tada cried and made me promise to count the stars for her wherever she was, and I promised, and I have kept it. I count them still, every clear night, an old fool counting stars for a child 2 states gone who I'll never see grown. Claude did not cry. Claude shook Amos's hand like a man and then could not let go of it, and Amos pulled him in, and the two of them stood like that a long moment, the boy's face hidden, and when Claude stepped back his eyes were dry by force of will alone, and I have never been prouder of anyone and never sadder. Desba and Amos said their goodbye apart from us, by the gate, and I did not watch, because some things a decent man leaves alone. And then the wagon went up the north road in the gray light, and we stood at the fence, the same fence, and watched it go small and smaller and gone. Coombs's committee came the next afternoon, 11 men, to a ranch with nothing left to put off it. And here is the ironic turn, the one I still don't know how to feel about. The bucket line men were among them. 5 or 6 of the men who'd helped at the Prout fire had ridden in Coombs's committee, out of fear, out of going along, out of whatever it is that makes decent men do indecent things in a crowd. They came to drive out a family that was already gone, and they found 2 tired men standing in an empty yard, and Amos walked out to meet them with no gun and said, "You're too late, or you're too early." They left. There's nobody here to be afraid of but me, and I'm not worth the ride. And those men sat their horses in our empty yard, and the wind went through, and one by one they could not meet his eye, not because they hated him now, but because they were ashamed, and shame is the beginning of the thing hate had been hiding. Coombs sat his horse longest. He'd come for a fight and there was no fight, come for a villain and there was only a family-shaped hole in the air, and I watched the grief he'd been outrunning finally catch him there in our yard, watched it come down on him in front of everyone, and he turned his horse without a word and rode off, and the others trailed after, and they never troubled us again. He died that winter, Coombs did, of nothing the doctor could name. I have my own name for it. Valley softened after that, the way Amos said it would, slow and too late to do the family any good, which is the cruelest kind of softening there is, the kind that comes around right after it could have mattered. Within 2 years there were Apache children in the Valley school. Within 5, a man could marry across that line and only the meanest few would say a word. Amos lived to see it. He'd pointed out to me sometimes the changes, quiet, and I knew what he was really saying, which was, it would have been all right. If they'd only held on a little longer, it would have been all right. And maybe it would have. Or maybe Desba was right and the holding on would have gotten somebody killed before the softening came. We'll never know. That's the part that doesn't close. That's the part I still turn over at the fence. He never married, Amos. He was a young enough man after, and there were women who'd have had him once the valley turned, and he never did. He didn't talk about it. I didn't ask. Some doors a decent man leaves shut. A letter came once, years on. No return on it, just a smear of trail dust and a far postmark, and inside one sheet of paper in a careful schoolboy hand, English learned somewhere up north, and it said only this, that the writer had a place now in cattle, and that he eased the calves into the world with his own hands the way he'd been taught, gentle, unafraid of the blood, and that he had a daughter, and that he had named her for a season, and that he wanted the man who taught him to know it. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Amos read it standing at the kitchen window and read it again, and then he went out to the porch and sat a long time in the dark, and when I brought him out a coffee, he didn't say anything, and neither did I. He kept that letter in his Bible till the day he died. I have it now. I take it out some nights and I read the careful hand and I count the words in it. There are 63. And then I go outside, old man that I am, and I look up, and I count what I promised a small girl I would count, for as long as I've got eyes to count it. There were no good men left in this country. A wise man said so, and he was right about everything. He was wrong about one thing. I think about her arms opening sometimes. In the snow, the choosing, I never did learn the word for it.